The next key element in project management is stakeholders. Stakeholder analysis. What we want to find out is people, which we call stakeholders, that may have an impact on our project. That impact can be positive or can be negative. But either way, anyone who has an impact on our project is labeled a stakeholder. And what we want to do is we want to find out where that stakeholder is coming from, as what is their view towards our particular project. Are they for our project or are they against our project? And then secondarily, we want to say what kind of influence do they actually have within the organization. So what we do is we find out, we do conduct an interview, we find out and ask the stakeholder a few questions, and then we put him or her on this grid. Now, I advise you not to use their real names in case this grid gets out, because some people may not like that you say that they are for the project or against the project. I use a letter grade to represent an individual. So, for example, A here is actually an individual, and they are high influence and for our project. Then we have B, who is for our project but low influence. And then we have C, who's against our project but has low influence. And then we have D, who is high influence and against our project. Now, the reason we map this out is really what we want to do is we want everybody to be for our project. And so we want to come up with strategies as how do we move D to A? And so we come up with strategies. We think about some ways about how we can actually do that. We're going to explore those ways in a minute from now. Before we explore what ways we can, strategies we can use to sway our stakeholders to move more in favor of our project, we need to identify some of the key stakeholders. For example, your sponsor, the person who commissioned you to do the project, obviously is a stakeholder. Customers are stakeholders and users are stakeholders. There's a difference between those two. The customers are the one who commission you to actually create something. The users are one who are actually going to use the product or result or service that you're going to create. The project manager obviously is a stakeholder. The core team members, the people that you selected are always on your team. Extended team members, as you draw on other departments and other areas, they're also stakeholders. We have subject matter experts that are stakeholders. And if you're dealing with something that impacts the public at large, then the public at large is going to be a stakeholder too. So there's many ways to do that. You just need to ask yourself a couple of questions. Who do you think is going to have an impact on our project? And that's the definition of a stakeholder. The art of stakeholder management is basically an art. Sometimes it's a science, but maybe it's a combination of being an art and a science. The key thing you have to remember here is that stakeholders play many roles. They can be positive and negative, and they can actually change from positive to negative depending on where your project is at what point in time. Managing stakeholders doesn't have to be difficult. It just means that you have to pay attention to them and find out what their needs are and where they are at that particular point in time as relation to your project. The key, again, is to start early and to assess as you go through, as you roll out your project. Now, one of the questions is, how do I know who a stakeholder is? Well, that's very difficult in an organization to understand who is actually a stakeholder. But there is one thing that you do know. You do know that you have a sponsor. And a sponsor usually is a little higher up in the organization, has a little bit more influence, and most likely is positive towards your project. So whenever you have a conversation, do an interview with the sponsor, you find out a whole bunch about the project and about who the sponsor is. What you really want to do is you want to ask, at the end of your interview, you want to ask him or her this question. Is there anyone else that you know that would or could have an impact on this project? Get the names of those individuals and then go to that individual and talk to them about the project, get a sense of where they're at. And at the end of that interview, what you do is you ask the same question. You basically say, do you know anyone else that may have an impact on this project? And you go down to a level where you're at a lower level of influence, and then you stop. So that's how you determine who your stakeholders are. Now, a more difficult thing is to move a stakeholder who are against your project into one who's for your project. Well, there's two strategies that you can use. Strategy number one is, if that's a high influence individual, that's against your project, then align that individual with a high influence individual that's for your project and get them to have a dialogue and demonstrate the value of the project to that individual. That's strategy number 1. Strategy number 2 is to go to that individual, talk to them, have a sense of where they're coming from, get some sort of sense of who they are and all that sort of stuff. And at the very end of it, what you do is you say to them, what is the one thing that this project could do to bring you on board? And then you be quiet and wait for their answer. Do not interrupt. Do not tell them what it is. Wait until they give you an answer. Now, they may not give you the correct answer or the absolute answer at one time. Just repeat that. So what is the one thing that this project could do to bring you on board? Now, once they honestly tell you what that one thing is, then what you do is you conclude by saying this. If this project could deliver this one thing, you would be on board. Is that true? Again, wait for the answer. Now, if they have told you the one thing, then what you do is you then go and see, can I actually deliver that? And if you can, you go back and tell them. If you can't, you go back and say, I can't deliver that. Is there another thing you can do? And continue on. And that will bring them on board. That's a secondary strategy, and it works quite nicely in organizations. Next assignment, watch the video using the project case information and follow the instructions in the next lesson.